Recorder. Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our series of shiurim on medical halacha in the Mastery of Halacha program. Before we begin with the material, let me make some introductory comments. Welcome to those of you who are new to the Web Yeshiva. Welcome back to those who are returning to the Web Yeshiva. These shiurim are all recorded, and around 24 hours or so after each class, the class will be available on archive through the internet site. So if you miss a class or if you want to review a class, you can always download the class from the internet site. The classes are available in a variety of formats, and you can choose the format which is best for your hardware. In the course of each class, you are free to ask questions. Now, the simplest way to ask a question is to type your question on chat and then send it. I will see your question. Your question will appear on my screen, and in the course of the shiur, I can incorporate the answer to your question in the ongoing class, in the ongoing shiur. Now, the source sheets which we are basing this on, these source sheets are available to you through the internet site. If you visit the course page on the internet site, and you'll see the words Word and PDF on the first square, on the first meeting of this class. If you want to download the source sheets in Word format, click on Word. If you want in PDF format, you click on PDF, and you can have the source sheets for yourself. Now, I know that not all of you are native speakers of English. If it's easier for you to type a question on chat in another language, there are a number of other languages which I can handle very easily. כמובן, אפשר לשאול שאלות בעברית. On peut poser des questions en français. Wenn Sie wollen, können Sie Fragen auf Deutsch stellen. Se puede hacer preguntas también en español. I have a number of other languages if you need. Just let me know. Okay, that's the introductory material. Now, if you are watching this on archive, on the recorded version of this class, and you have a question, so chat's not going to help you, but you can always send me a question by email here on chat. I've just given you my email address. Feel free to send me an email question on any of the archived classes. Just mention in your archive the original date of the class and approximately how many minutes into the class you're asking about. You have the timeline on the bottom of the screen. Then I'll know exactly what it is you're referring to, and I'll be able to respond to your question by return email. Now, our first issue in medical halacha, the first issue which we're dealing with is the issue of abortion. Induced abortion, what occurs spontaneously, is usually just called a miscarriage, and although miscarriages are of great interest as far as the laws of Nida are concerned, the laws of spontaneous miscarriage are not going to interest us in this series of classes. We're talking about induced abortion made by man. Now, of course, our approach is going to be the approach which I take in all of my classes, namely to marshal together the principal sources in the rabbinic tradition, to go through them one at a time and draw conclusions from them regarding the opinions of the great rabbis. Now, of course, not surprisingly, the issue begins with the biblical text. Let's see if I can Click it right. Ah, here we got it. The biblical text deals indirectly with the question of abortion. Let's see what the verses in the Torah have to say, and then, of course, we're going to proceed to the way the great rabbis in the course of generations understood, the way the great rabbis interpreted, the way they understood this verse. Well, let's first see the verse in the Torah. What it says is, "V'chi yinatzu anashim." Two men are fighting. Like this is a story. Two men who are fighting with each other. That's a typical story. But what happens during this fight? Nagfu isha hara. There's a pregnant woman, an innocent bystander. A pregnant woman is just standing near the location where these guys are fighting, and the guys are fighting with each other. And in the course of the fight, one of them strikes her. The pregnant woman gets a blow in this fight. Uh, it happens. Innocent bystanders get injured when two men fight with each other. What happened? She was pregnant. That's part of the story. Yatsu yiladeha. Her children came out. That means the blow to her body caused an abortion. Hello, yeah, son, but it wasn't disastrous. They did cause an abortion, but it wasn't an ason. It wasn't disastrous. Don't know exactly what that means. We're gonna have to figure out what disastrous means in a few minutes. We're going to be discussing that. Well, what happens if one of the men caused an abortion, but a non-disastrous abortion? What happens is, anosh ye anesh, the man who's guilty has to be punished. Ka'asher yashit alav, oh dear, ka'asher yashit alav bal ha'isha, the guy who did the injury, the guy who caused the abortion is going to have to pay. And who's he going to have to pay? He's going to have to pay the woman's husband. Well, that's perfectly reasonable, I suppose, given a certain orientation in this world. I suppose it's perfectly reasonable. You injure someone's property, you injure someone's cow, so of course you have to pay for the injury you did. You injure someone's slave, so of course you have to pay for the injury you did. You injure someone's wife, so of course you have to pay for the injury you did. So I suppose that in a certain social framework, it makes perfect sense that it's the husband who was injured here, and he's the one who has to be paid. How much does he get paid? Natan b'flilim. The payment has to be made in the court, in the plilim. In modern Hebrew, plilim refers to criminal law, but in the older texts, the word plilim can be any kind of law court, not necessarily a criminal law court. A court of law. The rabbis are going to have to sit as judges and figure out how much he is going to have to pay the husband of the wife for having injured her. But all of this is true only if he strikes her, causing an abortion, but no disaster. No disaster. No, that's so horrible. Im ason yehiyeh. If, on the other hand, this is a disastrous event, Vinatata nefesh tachat nefesh, then it's a capital crime and the death penalty is imposed. Oh, well, we see now that there are two kinds of abortions, a less serious and a more serious kind of abortion. In the less serious kind, not an ason, not a disaster. It's only a financial matter between the perpetrator and the family of the woman who was injured. In the more serious abortion, where there is an ason, a disaster, then it's a capital case. Death penalty is imposed. Now, it's perfectly clear, is it not, that the disaster that we're referring to, the difference between a serious case and a not so serious case, the difference between a disastrous case and a non-disastrous case. The difference is whether or not there's death involved. If there's no death involved, then it's only financial compensation that is required. If, on the other hand, you caused death, then that's a capital. That's murder, and that calls for capital punishment. Nefesh tachat nefesh, a life for a life. Now, for better or worse, that's a complicated way of saying the verse is silent on who it is that died in the serious case. It's clear that if someone dies, then the death penalty comes into play here. But who is it who died? The verse is silent on this question. Now, if we look at the earliest commentaries, for example, the Targum, here we got the Targum Onkelos. The Targum Onkelos is the oldest rabbinic commentary on the Torah. Onkelos makes perfectly clear that the ason, the disaster we're talking about, is mota, death, but he too is silent about exactly who it is who died here. If no one dies, well, if no one dies, no one dies. It's purely a financial case. But if someone dies, then it's like murder. Then it's like murder. Then it's a capital case. But exactly who it is that died, he doesn't say. Now, in the grand history of interpretation of biblical texts, the grand history of interpretation of biblical texts divides largely along two lines. It's them and us. We have traditional Jewish understanding, traditional rabbinic understanding of the verse, and that's, of course, what we are going to be talking about in this series of Shiurim. On the other hand, there exists out there in the world a, uh, a Christian tradition in understanding the verses. Um, uh, well, let me just mention in passing that the Septuaginta, the Greek version, the ancient Greek version of the biblical text, the Septuaginta, the ancient Greek version, was originally a rabbinic product. It was originally the rabbis who translated the Tanakh, the Chumash, into Greek. Unfortunately, the text of the Septuaginta, which we have today, you can read it online, you can buy a copy. The Greek version, which we have today, is the product of a lot of Christian tampering. There are Christological references which have been inserted into the Greek translation all over the place. The Greek version which we have today is a Christian work. And in the Greek translation of this particular verse, the translation runs to around 3 times the length of the original verse. The translation really goes to town on this particular verse. And in the Greek version, the Christianized version of this verse, it's the death of the fetus which leads to the death penalty. The death of the fetus leads to the death penalty. That's the Christian approach. Now, we're presently going to see the sources. I guess give you a preview of what we're going to see in a few minutes. Rabbinic sources are unanimous. According to rabbinic sources, the death penalty is to be imposed only for taking the mother's life and not the life of the fetus. Um, well, as you correctly point out on chat, there's no particular point during pregnancy where the halacha changes. Throughout the entire duration of pregnancy, from conception until the very end, destruction of the life of the fetus is not a capital offense in the rabbinic tradition does not call for the death penalty. Now let's take this idea and understand it on the conceptual level. What's terribly important to try to pin down is the question of whether or not the fetus is, in the eyes of halacha, a person or not. Uh, if halacha considers the fetus to be a person, then taking the life of the fetus is a capital offense, and we have to start talking about whether or not the death penalty is applied. If, on the other hand, the fetus is not a person, well, then what is the fetus if not a person? If the fetus is not a person, the only other possibility is the fetus is to be considered part of the mother in Talmudic terms. You have the correct spelling on chat. In rabbinic terms, Talmudic terms, yerech imo, the fetus, if the fetus is not a person, all the fetus is part of the mother. The mother has a liver, the mother has kidneys, the mother has all of her organs and tissue. They're all part of her. And similarly, if she is pregnant, she has a fetus, and it's just part of her. Now, of course, if the fetus is a person, then the death penalty is on the table for destroying the fetus. If the fetus is not a person, it's part of the mother, yerech imo in Talmudic terminology, a part of the mother, then the death penalty is off the table. You cut off someone's finger, you don't get the death penalty for cutting off someone's finger. And in fact, sometimes it might be the proper thing to do. If the finger is gangrenous, so of course the surgeon is going to cut off the finger to save the patient's life. But if the kidney, has v'shalom, has a malignant tumor in it, you're probably going to want that. You're probably going to want an excisional biopsy. You're probably going to want to have that kidney removed from your body and destroyed. But you don't need a life-threatening situation to justify destroying part of someone's body. To extract a tooth, you don't need a life-threatening reason to extract someone's tooth. You just need a good reason. As long as you have a good reason, you're going to improve the person's quality of life. You're going to improve the person's general health. You're not saving the person's life. All he has is a bad tooth. But if you have a good reason to remove a tooth, then of course, it's justified. You don't need a life-threatening reason. If someone has poor vision because of a problem in the cornea, in the eye, of course you can remove the lesion in the cornea in the eye and replace it with some artificial replacement to improve the patient's eyesight. You're not saving the patient's life. The patient's life was not in danger, but you are definitely improving the quality of life for the patient. If you have a good reason, you can destroy part of the patient's body. You don't need a life-threatening reason, but all that's true only in the rabbinic tradition, only in the rabbinic tradition. All of this is true in the rabbinic tradition, according to which the fetus is not a person. Now, I promised a few minutes ago that we're going to see sources to prove that in the rabbinic tradition, the verse about the 2 men fighting is talking about death of the mother and not death of the fetus. I said we're going to see sources regarding that, and then the sources are endless. I just put on the screen probably commentary, the most famous rabbinic commentary on the Torah, and that's Rashi. Um, the number of sources could be multiplied endlessly. But when Rashi comments on the verse, he epitomizes the rabbinic understanding of the verse. And when it says imason yehiyeh, when the verse says if it's disastrous, he strikes her, causing an abortion, and it's ason, it's disastrous, leading to the death penalty. Isha, it's the woman who got killed. Of course, you can replace. Of course, you can replace an organ, remove an organ which has a serious problem, a defect, and replace it with a prosthetic. You're not saving, well, maybe you are, but even if you're not saving the patient's life, you're improving the quality of the patient's life, and that's surely okay. Um, so, so Rashi epitomizes the rabbinic tradition, just the opposite of the way Christian theologians understood the verse through the generations. Rashi epitomizes the rabbinic approach. Death penalty is on the table only for taking the mother's life. It follows, therefore, that taking the infant, the fetus's life, destroying the life of the fetus, is not a capital offense. Death penalty is off the table for performing an abortion. Of course, just because the death penalty is off the table doesn't mean it's permitted. It just means it's not as serious as murder. I mean, there are other prohibited things in the world besides murder. There are other reasons to prohibit things, but murder is not the reason to prohibit abortions in any situation. Murder, it is not, because murder has to do only with taking the mother's life, not the fetus's life. No. We've been talking over and over again about the death penalty, capital punishment, uh, and I've been translating the verse literally up until this point, speaking about the death penalty, capital punishment being imposed for taking the mother's life. But let's see what Rashi has to say about this death penalty. Here's what Rashi says. Rabotenu cholkim b'davar. The great rabbis through the generations are divided. They disagree among themselves. That's what rabbis do. They disagree with each other. Being a rabbi is more or less a full-time job, disagreeing with other rabbis. The um, the rabbis disagree about this death penalty, which the verse is talking about. Let's see the two opinions among the great rabbis. Yesh Omrim, some great rabbis say, Nefesh Mamish. When the verse imposes the death penalty, it means the death penalty, and we execute the guilty party. Assuming that all the evidence is at hand, and assuming the, the, the judicial procedure is all correct, and those are complicated matters also, but the death penalty is definitely on the table here as a possibility according to some rabbis. Yesh Omrim, other rabbis say, and here comes the majority view. The majority view has it, although the verse spoke about the death penalty, it didn't really mean the death penalty. It meant mamon, financial compensation. You have to pay financial compensation. Now, there are plenty of verses in the Torah which talk about, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. There are plenty of verses in the Torah which the rabbis understood in a non-literal way. If you put out someone's eye for an eye. We don't put out your eye just because you put out somebody, you destroyed someone else's eye. You have to pay compensation for what you did. And just as in many other verses, the rabbinic tradition rejects the literal meaning of the words and substitutes financial compensation for what the verse appears to be talking about. Similarly, in this case, it's not really the death penalty. Instead, it is mammon, financial compensation, which is required. Rashi is not the one who tells us that Rashi does not say flat out that this is the majority view. But here's a method for figuring out a method which often works, not always. The following method often works for figuring out which view is the definitive one, which view is the view which is the accepted majority view whenever there's a conflict. A good method a good method which usually works is if one opinion is just stated very briefly and then no longer discussed, and another opinion is discussed at great length. It's the opinion which is discussed at great length, which is the definitive one, the accepted one in halacha. The opinion which is just mentioned in passing, that opinion exists, but it's not the one which is embraced. The first opinion, talking about death penalty, really, the real death penalty, really executing someone, that's mentioned in passing here. The second opinion, financial compensation, Rashi is about to go to town, enlarging on exactly how it works. Now, it's well known, and if this were a shiur, if this were a series of classes about bodily injury, we would really want to detail the following in great. We want to detail the following very precisely. If you injure someone's body, there are a lot of things you have to pay compensation for. You have to pay compensation for medical costs. You have to pay compensation for out of work, how much time the person lost from work and how much he or she would have made during work. You have to pay for the pain and suffering. And then the Talmud has a lot to say about how to capitalize, how to evaluate, how to turn pain and suffering into a shekel amount, into a dollar amount. You have to pay for embarrassment if the injury which you did embarrasses someone, you're going to have to pay for that. And here too, the Talmud has a lot to say about capitalizing, about evaluating, about how to transform an act of embarrassment into a shekel amount, into a dollar amount. Uh, and you're also going to have to pay for for the injury which you inflicted on the person's body. Now, how on earth are we going to do that? Rashi explains. Lo nefesh mamish. We're not talking about imposing the death penalty according to the majority view. Why? Shamechaved laharag et zeh v'harag et zeh patur memisa. Because there's a general rule which is accepted by the rabbis. If you murder, in order to have the death penalty, murder has to be intentional. Accidentally killing someone doesn't call for the death penalty. The death penalty is to be imposed only for killing someone on purpose. You need kavana, you need intention in order to impose a death penalty. Purposeful, wanton murder, as opposed to an accident. Now, it's perfectly clear, according to the Talmud, that if someone if someone intends to kill person A, points the gun at person A, you intend to kill person A, you aim the gun at person A, and you miss. You miss. You killed person B instead. Okay? You killed person B. So here's someone, he took the gun in hand, or the bow and arrow, whatever it is. He took his weapon in hand, intending to kill person A, missed, and he killed person B. Now, there was intention to kill here. He did want to murder. Intention to murder, he definitely wanted to do. That's why he shot the gun. On the other hand, he did not intend to kill the victim whom he actually killed. It's well established in the Gemara that someone who intends to commit an act of murder, victim A, and misses, and he ends up killing victim B, is exempt from the death penalty. That's not called enough intention. That's not called enough kavana to impose the death penalty. Instead, mishalem liyorshav. You have to pay. And who do you pay? Well, you killed the person. You can't pay the victim anymore. The victim is dead. Who do you pay? You pay dumov. You pay money to the inheritors of your victim. Now, the way to figure out the shekel amount or the dollar amount that has to be paid to the inheritors of the victim, you have to evaluate the victim as though he were a slave being sold in the slave market. What does that mean? What does that mean? The evaluation of damage which is done to the human body is that damage, evaluating it in shekel amount or in dollar amount, follows in rabbinic traditions a tradition which we're about to explain, very, very different from what we find in Western systems of law. I'm going to give you an extreme example, uh, not a very realistic one, but at least a good example to illustrate the point. Well, once you understand the point from this bizarre example I'm about to concoct, then you'll understand how it works. You'll be able to apply it in real cases if ever you're a judge on the Sanhedrin and you have such a case before your court. Imagine for a moment the unusual case of someone who is a surgeon. He's a surgeon. And he's being sold on the slave market. Well, she is a surgeon, and she is being sold on the slave market. Now, the purchasers have to calculate in their minds a reasonable price that they're willing to pay for this surgeon, for this slave. And the way they will figure out the value of this slave, how much they're willing to pay on the slave market, is they have to calculate how much income this slave can bring in over the expected life expectancy, over the expected lifetime of the slave. Then the purchasers will have a clear understanding of the financial value of the slave, and that will dictate the value of the slave on the slave market when the slave is auctioned for sale. Now, if someone cuts off this slave's hand, just slices off his hand, now he obviously can't be a surgeon anymore. So what you do is you bring this slave, this surgeon who no longer has a hand because someone cut off his hand, and you hide the stump of his hand behind his back, and you find out how much money this slave will fetch on the slave market, while everyone thinks incorrectly that he's a surgeon who's going to bring in a lot of money in the course of a lifetime performing surgery. After you figure out the price that this person will fetch as a slave performing surgery, depending upon the slave's age and specialty and all kinds of calculations which people will have. Now he takes the stump of his hand out from behind his back and he says, "Ta-da! This slave cannot actually perform any surgery because the hand was cut off. What's the value now?" And the value obviously is going to go down, not to zero. The slave can still do other labor, but it's going to go down a lot. And the difference between the value of the slave as a surgeon and the value of the same person who cannot perform surgery because of the injury which you inflicted on the person's body, that difference in value is the amount you have to pay for having injured the person. Now, remember I promised a bizarre case. Here comes the bizarre case which I promised you. Let us now imagine someone who is fully qualified as a surgeon with expectation of making 100,000 shekels a year for the next 20 years, whatever it is. Now, let us further imagine that this same victim is also a fully trained and brilliant opera singer, a tenor, and so good as an opera singer that maybe she's a soprano, whatever this opera singer is doing, can bring in The same amount, 100,000 shekels per year for the next 20 years. Now, of course, whoever's going to buy this slave can employ the slave either as a surgeon or as an opera singer, bringing in money this way or that way. Can't do both. Both are full-time jobs. Now, if you cut off that person's hand, you have not significantly reduced the value of this person on the slave market, because prior to the injury, this person would have potential income of 100,000 shekels per year for the next 20 years, and after the injury, the potential income is more or less the same. They're probably not going to get so many roles in the opera because of the stump of the hand, but surely the decrease in value is not going to be nearly as steep as the one profession slave who's only qualified to be a surgeon. So in the rabbinic tradition, the evaluation, the value of the hand that was cut off, the value of the injury that was inflicted on the person's body, is that evaluation is made not by looking only at the lesion. You don't look only at the injury. You look at the person as a whole. You take the value of the person as a whole and see how much that global value has declined as a result of the injury. That's the way we figure out what the payment is. In any event, bottom line, we're left clearly and definitively with the conclusion that the death penalty is off the table for destroying the fetus, and therefore the fetus is clearly not considered a person until birth. And then a little bit later on, we're going to have to talk about exactly what point in time the fetus acquires the status of being a person. We're going to have to talk about that in great detail. That's going to come up. But from conception until birth, and defining the moment of birth is going to be very important a little bit later on. But from conception till birth, approximately 9 months. Standard deviation 2 weeks. The fetus is not a person, and therefore you don't need a life-saving reason to justify destroying the fetus. All you need is a good reason. And of course, we're going to have to talk later in great detail about how to figure out what a good reason is and what is not a good reason. Let's go one step further. We're about to look at the Mechilta. As you know, there are two kinds of midrash. That is Midrash Rabbah, which deals with the storyline of the biblical text. That's not of great interest to us in this series of Shiurim. But there's another body of Midrash called Midrash Halacha, which deals with the halachic content of Chumash. There is no Midrash Halacha in Sefer Breshit because Sefer Breshit has so little halacha in it. But on all the other parts of Chumash, beginning with Shmot, there is a Midrash Halacha, a Midrash which goes verse by verse, dealing with the halachic content of the Chumash. And we're about to quote from the Mechilta, which is the halachic midrash on Sefer Shmot. Now, the rabbis who gave us this midrash are exactly the same rabbis who gave us the Mishnah. And indeed, through the generations, rabbis have been divided, and to this day, historians, scholars are divided, disagree among themselves on the question of which came first. Did the rabbis of the Talmudic period first arrange all of the halachic stuff? Did they arrange the stuff of halacha in subject matter order? That's the Mishnah, where everything is arranged more or less by subject matter. Or did they first organize all of the stuff of halacha in the order of the psukim, in the order of biblical verses? Which came first? According to some great rabbis and some historians, the midrash form that we're about to look at came first, and in the course of time it was reorganized in the Mishna format in subject matter order. According to other rabbis and other modern historians, the opposite is true. The rabbis first edited, first organized the stuff of halacha in subject matter form, that's the Mishnah, and later it was reorganized in a midrash form, following the orders of the psukim. But literary criticism, literary history, as important as it is not going to affect our conclusions one way or another. Let's just see what the great rabbis of the Mishnaic period had to say about our issue. Since we're talking about halachic midrash, of course, the midrash begins by quoting a verse and then talks about the verse. So the verse is Makeh ish vamet. You strike a man and he dies. That means you kill someone. Mot yumat. Death penalty is imposed. That's what the verse in the Torah says. Strike someone so that the victim dies. You kill someone, death penalty. That's the verse in the Torah. The Midrash explains as follows. Shomani, I hear from this verse, I conclude from this verse, Af ben shmon b'mashma, that even someone who is 8 is included. Even someone who is 8. Strike someone who is 8. 8, not 7, not 9, but 8. Strike someone who is 8 and kill him, death penalty. After all, the verse doesn't seem to make any distinctions between this victim or that victim. It really doesn't matter who the victim is, even if the victim is 8. Death penalty is to be imposed for wanton killing of that person. Talmud Lomar, no. That's not the correct meaning of the verse. Because the verse does say, Makeh ish. If you strike an ish, then you get the death penalty. Someone who is 8 is not an ish, and therefore no death penalty for that. You get the death penalty only for striking and killing an ish, not someone who is 8. Magid, this thereby teaches us, she'eno chayev, this therefore teaches us that you are not imposing the death penalty. We do not impose the death penalty ad sheyaharog ben kiyama, unless you kill someone who is ben kiyama, someone who is viable, someone who otherwise would have lived. What on earth is going on here? Well, this person who is 8 is not talking about someone who's 8 years old. This person who is 8, the victim here, who was killed, is not someone who is 8 years old. Rather, it's someone who was born after 8 months of pregnancy. So Ben Shmona, someone who was 8, that's what we in modern English would call a premature baby. Premature baby pregnancy is normally 9 months. Everyone knows that based on the song which we sing in Leil HaSeder. And a baby which is born prior to 9 months is premature. And back in those days, without modern medicine, back in those days, premature babies were not viable. They did not survive very long. And the rule is that in order to impose the death penalty, we must know with absolute surety that the perpetrator killed the victim. If we do not know with absolute certainty, I'm not talking about reasonable possibility. If we do not know with absolute certainty that the perpetrator kill the victim. There's no death penalty. In order to impose the death penalty, you need to be absolutely 100% sure. Now, what happens if a baby is born and along comes someone and destroys that newborn baby, kills the newborn baby? Now, if the newborn baby was premature, the baby was going to die anyway. And now the perpetrator has the perfect defense before the court of law, before the Sanhedrin. The perpetrator can say, it's true, I stabbed this baby. It's true, I stabbed it. But the baby was about to die anyway, and just happened to die at the same time I put in the knife. Uh, uh, someone, the victim, who is about to die anyway, not a Ben Kaima, not a viable person. How you going to know that the perpetrator actually killed the person? Maybe the person was about to die anyway. Just happened to die at the same time that the knife went in, at the same time that the arrow went in. There's no way to know, and therefore, no death penalty. Death penalty has to be imposed. Death penalty can be imposed only if we know with absolute surety that the perpetrator actually killed the person, and therefore you need a viable person, a viable victim, not an end stage cancer patient, not a premature baby, not a victim who was, for whatever reason, anyway about to die. Now, you see from this that destroying the life of the fetus, we already know that that's not a capital offense. No death penalty for that. But now we see further, even after birth, there is no death penalty until such time as the baby has proven its viability, and then the perpetrator can get the death penalty. Now, I emphasize once again what I repeated before, just because the death penalty is off the table doesn't mean it's permissible to take a knife and stab it into a premature baby. It just means it's not something which is liable to capital punishment as an act of murder because it cannot be proven. Just because you can't prove it's an act of murder doesn't mean it's permissible. Now, the let's take this idea one step further. Here we go. The Mishnah, from exactly the same time period as the previous text, the Mishnah deals with a case which brings us much closer to actual real cases of abortion. Let's see the text of the Mishnah. Ha'isha, a woman, a pregnant woman, shehi Mukshilei, a woman who has difficulty in birth. I don't know what the difficulty is here, but there's something unusual, something irregular about this birth. It's not your routine birth. There's some problem here, and of course, the list of irregularities, the list of problems which can occur during childbirth is a very long list. Back in those days, such problems were more serious than they are nowadays. And nowadays, problems in childbirth can almost always be dealt with in modern medical circumstances. But back then, things were not so good. Back then, the woman who is Mukshilei, she's having some difficulty here in giving birth, and we don't yet know what that difficulty is. We cannot define it. What are you supposed to do? You perform, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to perform an act of surgery, dismembering the fetus in her womb. The fetus is still in the womb. You enter the womb and you dismember, you cut apart the fetus limb by limb inside the womb. This kills the fetus, obviously. Umotzi'inoto, and you take the fetus out of the womb, evarim evarim, one limb at a time. Why? Why? Mipnei shechayea kodmim l'chayev. Because her life, the mother's life, takes precedence over its life, the fetus's life. Given a conflict here, you're able to save either the mother or the fetus, but not both. Mother's life takes precedence. And therefore, in order to save the mother's life, it is correct to destroy the fetus. In the words of the Mishna, perform an act of surgery, dismembering the fetus limb by limb inside the womb and removing the fetus one limb at a time. That's obviously going to result in death of the fetus. No doubt about that. Now, of course, it's correct for the surgeon to cut off a gangrenous finger, which is threatening the patient's life. If you have a gangrene on a finger, of course, that will threaten your life. And of course, the way to save the patient's life is by cutting off the finger. Of course, life-saving justifies destroying part of the patient, even if we're talking about a fetus. And after all, we've already established that the fetus, prior to birth, has the status of being part of its mother. However, Yatsa Rubo, once the birth process has begun and the baby is coming out of the birth canal, the Yatsa Rubo, the majority of the baby has left the mother, and the baby is a certain length from head to toe. As soon as a majority of the baby has come out of the mother, from that point in time, from that exact point in time, ein nogin bo, you can no longer harm the baby. Why not? Why can you no longer harm the baby once a majority of the body has been delivered? She'ein dolchin nefesh mipnei nefesh, because you cannot kill one person to save another. Well, that's a big rule. You can't kill one person to save another. If you need a heart transplantation in order to save your life, you can't murder someone else to harvest a heart in order to save your life. You can't kill one person to save another. Well, therefore, even though the mother's life is in danger here, and that's what justified the the dismemberment of the fetus, even though the mother's life is in danger, and that indeed justified the dismemberment of the fetus. All of this is true up to a specific point in time, namely the moment that the majority of the baby's body has been delivered. That is the point in time at which this infant is no longer a fetus, a part of its mother, but is now a nefesh, an independent person. The newborn, not yet, we don't yet know that the newborn is viable, but it's now a person, and you can't kill it to save someone else. Um, the This passage now goes far in tying together all of the various ideas we have learned up till this point. Let's see if we can summarize. If there's some difficulty in giving birth, and again, the Mishnah is vague on the nature of this difficulty, what do? You dismember the fetus limb by limb, and in simple English, destroy the fetus and save the mother. However, Once the majority of the baby has been delivered, is no longer in the mother, measure how many centimeters from head to toe, majority of that has been delivered, then the baby is now a nephesh, is now a person, and of course, you can't kill one person to kill, and you can't kill one person to save another. Yes, Yatzar Rusho is part of the birth process, um, and up until now we've been wondering up to this point, if the fetus is not a person and you and I are persons, what's the point in time at which the status of person attaches to the fetus, and the fetus moves from fetus to baby? What's the point in time where the legal status, the halachic status of being a nefesh, a person, attaches to this newborn? The answer is when a majority of the baby has been born, when a majority is no longer into the is no longer in the birth canal, no longer in the mother. Um, now, uh, the Mishnah, which we've just looked at, leaves us. Yeah, well, if there are multiple births, then it's the same issue. Each individual fetus becomes a person when it is born, and the time interval between between the birth of twins varies greatly from case to case. The what we've seen so far is that there is clearly some room for abortions. Indeed, there seem to be, it's clear, there's some situations in which abortion is what you're supposed to do. Halacha calls for, halacha demands abortion in the case where you're saving the mother's life. Up to this point, that's fairly clear. Now, I want to add a footnote at this point to clarify something you've been asking about on chat, something I had not intended getting into, but I suppose it is important. How do you know when a baby is full term after 9 months of pregnancy, or premature, what is called an 8 month child, in the words of the Gemara, the words of the Mishnah? How do you know? Well, in general, in most situations, it's impossible to know whether or not the baby is a full term baby. In general, it's impossible to know what the exact date of conception was. After all, in most normal situations, husband and wife live together, and pinpointing the exact date of conception is, in most circumstances, not really possible. Um, but sometimes it is possible to establish the exact date of conception. If a woman goes through her nida period and then goes to the mikveh, uh, after the mikveh, she is intimate with her husband. Husband and wife are intimate exactly once, and then he goes traveling overseas on a business trip and doesn't come back until months later. Well, if he comes back months later and the wife is pregnant, so it's perfectly obvious what the exact date of conception was. But this is an unusual case, and in most circumstances, it's not easy at all. In most circumstances, we cannot prove whether or not the baby was born after a full, precise 9 month interval. Well, maybe the interval was a little bit shorter. In other words, in general, every newborn is going to have to be considered premature, not viable, because the number of cases in which we can prove what the date of conception was, where husband and wife were intimate exactly once, and then he went on a business trip abroad. These are unusual cases, and usually don't occur, obviously. And we're not interested here in the earliest date. We're not interested in the earliest possible date of conception. We're interested in the moment of actual conception and measuring exactly 9 months from then. That's what will determine a full-term baby. In general, we cannot make that exact calculation, and therefore, in general, babies will have the status of being premature. at the time they are born. Tov, that's the end of the footnote. And with this, we've covered some basic ground. We've learned that abortions are called for. Halacha demands abortions in some situations, namely where the mother's life is in danger. We've learned that abortion cannot carry the death penalty with it. We have learned that the reason that abortion cannot carry the death penalty with it is because the victim, the fetus, is not from the Torah point of view, not from the halachic point of view, a person until the majority of the baby's body has been born. With this, we're going to pause this evening. 1 week from tonight, we will continue with this. We're still dealing with the very early sources, and next week we're going to have to start bringing it down to the more modern, more contemporary sources, and seeing what the more modern, contemporary rabbis have to say about this. Until next week, I wish you a good week and eventually a Shabbat Shalom, and look forward to seeing you all again a week from tonight. Until then, Shalom, Shalom.